Pleasure to welcome Angela McRobbie to lecture here this evening. I think certainly it's the first time since I've been here that Angela's come to lecture. She's going to lecture on rethinking fashion and feminism, drawing on kind of research that she's done on the relationship between art school trained fashion designers and the fashion industry. Angela McRobbie is an extremely well-known sociologist. She's a reader in sociology at Loughborough University and author of Postmodernism and Popular Culture and the forthcoming Fashion and the Image Industries. So I'd like to welcome Angela McRobbie.
This paper is based on a study I've been doing over the last few years of, as Mark indicated, the British fashion industry. But I hope that the way that I present it, it will have some broader implications for the future of the culture industries in Britain, and it might even have some implications for the practice of architecture. In fact, there's great feelings often of resignation when people think about the fashion industry in Britain. Despite the tremendous publicity and despite the apparent success, most recently of figures like Galliano and Alexander McQueen, most people who work in a fashion industry know that it's an incredibly volatile place to work. It's an incredibly unreliable, very fragile industry. And for this reason, there's been a lack of clear political thinking in relation to the fashion industry. There's often a sense that it's really an unmanageable kind of thing, and that despite the great talent of British fashion designers, there isn't any way in which that talent can really be transformed into something which is thriving, vigorous, and also responsible. And what I want to try and do this evening is go through the various sectors which actually comprise the British fashion industry, and I want to suggest to you that they actually exist in a relationship of mutual dependence to each other. The British fashion industry actually comprises of a number of different sectors. It includes garment manufacture and production, of course. It also includes education and training. It includes the practice of design. It includes the image industries, the magazines. It also, of course, includes the retail sector. And then also, to understand British fashion, we also have to think about consumers and the marketplace. And my argument is that all of these are mutually dependent on each other. We have to understand the relationship between them in order to think about how we can make the fashion industry a more thriving, more successful place. Now, one of the ways of approaching the fashion industry is to look at it also as a feminized sector. Despite the publicity surrounding key figures like Hussein Chalayan, John Galliano, and Alexander McQueen, in fact, most people who work in the fashion industry are women. Most people who work in the garment sector and garment production are, of course, it's a totally feminized sector. Most designers are women. It's still the case that well over 75% of fashion students are female. Most people who work in the fashion magazine sector are female. So it remains a feminized sector of industry. And that allows us another route into understanding fashion design and the fashion industry altogether. Now, back in the 1970s, feminism was pretty dismissive of fashion. The attitude was that it was an exploitative sector. It was an area where women typically worked for very, very low pay, and it was an area associated with sweated labor in the third world. So the first feminist critique of fashion was that it was an area of exploitation. And the second critique of fashion by feminists was that even in the developed world, fashion also exploited women. It exploited women as consumers. It made them anxious about their bodies. It made them feel that they had to achieve unachievable images and unachievable levels of slimness and beauty. So that was the second way in which fashion was criticised by feminists. And then thirdly, again back in the 70s, it was seen as an area where women were compelled to consume, that women, it was an area of the imperative to buy was deeply embedded in fashion culture, and that it was almost impossible to avoid this seduction of consumption. And then suddenly, by the late 70s and the early 80s, feminists stopped being so critical of fashion. And they seemed to do an about turn. And instead of being critical of fashion, they began to say, well, perhaps fashion's not such a bad thing. Perhaps it's a good thing. In fact, it might even be an area where we can rediscover aspects of feminine culture. And so in the early 80s, feminists began to think about pleasures in fashion in the same way as they thought about pleasures in romance. And so in this second wave of feminists thinking about fashion, there was a sense in which fashion was redefined as an area of popular culture, as an area of potential pleasure and enjoyment for women. And this drew attention to the actual meanings of fashion and the way in which fashion played a particular role in feminine leisure culture. And that takes us up really to about the mid-1980s. Now, my argument tonight is that one of the problems with this rediscovery of fashion and pleasure is that it excluded the production end of fashion. It excluded the extent to which fashion was something which was also a major form of work and employment. In order to rediscover the pleasures of fashion, feminists had to ignore or not think about the extent to which sweated labour in garment production was still absolutely dominant, not just in the third world, or the so-called third world, but also in the developed world. So this leads to a rather one-sided view that, first of all, fashion is synonymous with the exploitation of women and with turning women merely into manipulated consumers. And then, the second level, it's seen as just a sphere of enjoyment for relatively privileged women. And in neither of those areas is there any sense in which fashion actually exists as something which connects across a whole range of areas where the consumers can actually be connected with the producers. So what I want to do is to, in a sense, outline what might be a more thorough and a more exhaustive analysis of the fashion industry, showing the way in which these various component parts actually connect with each other. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about each sector, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to be drawing on my current research. So the first sector I want to return to is that of garment making and manufacture and production. And it's very rare that fashion designers and fashion design students and fashion academics actually think about the role of garment production and manufacture. If you like, that's been a deeply unfashionable area of study in the last 10 years. And it's only very recently, particularly in America, that there has been renewed attention through the anti-sweatshop campaign of actually the role of the women who make clothes for Donna Karan or Calvin Klein. Now, how can we think through the role of garment producers in relation to the British fashion industry? And one of the most interesting and useful studies in this respect is a study by a sociologist called Annie Fazakerley, and it's called Unpacking the Fashion Industry. And what Annie Fazakerley looks at, and what I've also been looking at more recently, is the way in which garment production in Britain actually has been revitalized through the rise and the increasing prominence of British fashion designers, which is to say that British fashion design of the sort we associate with people like Ali Capolino or Helen Storey, who is now ceased trading, or any of the names that you are likely to be familiar with, people like Alexander McQueen or Hussein Chalayan or Piers Fionda, that their activity as designers has actually played a role in transforming the nature of garment production in this country. Now, what that means is that large-scale manufacturing has become a sunset industry. There are now relatively few huge factories of the sort that used to exist in the north of England and which were completely associated with fashion and clothing industry in this country. And they've been replaced by new forms of small units of production of the sort that actually, living in London, you're bound to have seen or come into contact with or driven past. All the big fashion companies in Britain are much more likely to use local, small units of production of the sort that are found in Hackney in East London, or Hornsey, or in Seven Sisters Road in Finsbury Park. And these small units of production are now what service the fashion industry. However, very little attention has been paid to them, and the only equivalent work that has been done on the revitalization of these units of production in New York have heralded the revitalization of this as the return to the sweatshop. So a number of economists are saying that these small units of production represent a new kind of sweatshop. Now, what I want to suggest is that in the British economy and in British fashion, these small, tiny units of production actually emerge out of Thatcherist enterprise culture. As Annie Fazakerley shows, the people who set these units up, actually I think I'll do without my glasses, I'll put them back on and say, the people who set these units of production up, mostly from the early 1980s, tended to be usually Asian men who had been made redundant from the car factories and from heavy industry. So that the units of production that you'll see both in the Turkish Cypriot community and in the Asian community actually emerge out of enterprise culture and out of Thatcherist economics. Now, these are very vulnerable small units. They don't have very high profit margins, and they rely on very, very low wage economies. They rely on the cheap labor of mostly Asian or Turkish Cypriot women. And recently, there's been one or two articles in The Guardian, The Independent, showing how many of these manufacturers, these women machinists, are actually working for wages of less than £1 an hour. Now, that is what garment making looks like now in relation to British fashion. And the extent to which this is a very exploited, very low-pay sector tends to make people feel very fatalistic, very pessimistic about what can be done, because there is very little alternative. There seems to be very little way of improving the situation of these women who are doubly disadvantaged both by race and by gender. Bangladeshi women too, working in the East End of London. And what I want to suggest this evening is, however, these women are not so far removed. There isn't so many miles away from the designers themselves. And I want to suggest that, in fact, the designers can connect with their producers if we could actually think of ways of bringing them together. And I'll come back to that later in the lecture. So garment production in this country is increasingly relocated away from the factories of the north to small units of production round the big cities, round Birmingham, round Nottingham, and certainly round London. And these are, of course, non-unionized, very cheap labor, and wages are particularly low because, as you probably know, the fashion industry comprises of so many different levels. The cut, make, and trim economy means that people get their cut at so many different levels that profits are incredibly low, almost right through to the bottom. And what I'm trying to think is how it can be more rationalized, how, in fact, those various levels can be brought together, and how the middlemen could be cut out, giving better conditions for the garment makers themselves. So I'll come back to that later in the lecture. Now, the second level of practice in the fashion design industry is, of course, that of the designers themselves. My research has followed a sample of 30 young fashion designers, many of whom you'll know, although they tend to be somewhat out of the limelight in the last couple of years. I followed up a sample of young designers who graduated from St. Martin's, Central St. Martin's, in the mid-80s. And I got a very clear breakdown of their employment experience in the British fashion industry over a period of 5 to 7 years. And in fact, every single one of my sample had been on a scheme called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which is now no longer in existence, but which was a way, in fact, of getting people off the dole. Another way of saying that is that fashion designers actually, in order to do their own work, to do their creative work, also came out of a culture of unemployment, in the same way as the units of production emerged out of redundancies in car factory and the running down of heavy industry. 1980s graduates in fashion design also found themselves with very little alternative but to go on the dole, and once they were on the dole, then to go on the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which paid them £40 a week and gave them some set-up equipment and funds in order to work for themselves. Now, all the graduates I interviewed had actually been on this particular scheme. And what's more, most of them had ended up at one point or another over a period of 7 years either bankrupt or on the brink of bankruptcy. So these were not terribly successful businesses. They found it very difficult to survive, even though, and this was a deep irony, and it was also something that was quite significant, even though they were attracting a lot of publicity, they were getting a lot of attention in the fashion press, in the magazines, in the newspapers. So there seemed to be this incredible disparity between the attention and the publicity that the designers were getting and the fact that their turnovers were incredibly low, that many of them were hardly breaking even, and at least almost 50% of my whole sample had been bankrupt, leaving with debts of up to £20,000, £30,000. Now, you'll probably know some of these names. Barbara Sonnentag and Tracy Mulligan just went bankrupt about a year ago, Colden the Receivers. The other people who have contributed to this study were designers who were really highly thought of. People like Helen Story, who worked with Caroline Coates in Amalgamated Talent. People like Pam Hogg, people like Darla Jane Gilroy, and all of their experiences were the same, which was that they had high creative talent, but they weren't able to make a living for themselves. Now, one solution to this, one which is often found in the press and found in fashion journalism, well, they can always go abroad. British fashion talent goes abroad and they find jobs in Japan, or they go to New York, or they find work in France or Italy. Well, I have to say that my research has shown that most students who get jobs abroad actually also find themselves on short-term contracts, that they're also exploited abroad, that they go and work for Dior or Sonia Rico, but they're employed often on a freelance basis in incredibly bad conditions, and often on a one-year contract maximum. And in fact, most of the big fashion houses in Europe know that there's this huge amount of talent that emerges from the art schools every year, desperate for a job, and they know that they can, if you like, drain them for a couple of years and then look for another new crop of names coming out from the art schools the next year or the following year after that. So in fact, what my research shows is that fashion designers, young fashion designers, work abroad maximum a year or 2 years. And then they come back to London and they want to do their own work, because many of them, even if they've valued the experience that they've had abroad, nonetheless, they end up again with no savings, very low income, and often made unemployed or made redundant. So there is a return to Britain, and particularly a return to London. And that, again, is a good reason why policymakers and people in New Labour, or people who are involved, fashion experts, people working in this field, should actually not necessarily just say, well, our students get jobs abroad, because that actually is relatively short-sighted, it's short-term, and it's really rather inaccurate. So the question then is, well, how can young fashion designers work more successfully in London? How can we translate the talent, the energy, and the enthusiasm that they've got into something that is more sustainable? Now, one of the most noticeable features of British fashion designers, indeed one of the ways in which they're trained, is indeed to know nothing about production. There is absolutely, in their training, again from my research, and I could be a little bit wrong here, but my research shows that there is really no connection between learning to study creative design and knowing how a dress is made or knowing how a shirt is made. Indeed, many of the students pride themselves on not knowing how to sew. And they will, on many occasions, say, oh, I can't sew, or oh, I don't know how to put a zip in. And that's actually, in many ways, part of the training that they are, they rather, if they don't look down upon, they have a very rigid division of labour, that they do creative work, and therefore they don't need to know about production. Now, what this means is that when they actually get an order, when their collection goes in the window of Browns and they suddenly find themselves with an order, they know very little about how to put that order into production. And surprise, surprise, the middlemen and the wholesalers rip them off like mad. Either that, or, more common, the production is not done at the quality they expect because they're not used to visiting a factory. They don't actually know how to translate their creative ideas into something that is properly made. And if the order comes back a week late or 2 weeks late, or if the sleeve is in the wrong way, as is very common, they're suddenly out of business. You know, the order isn't renewed, they have messed up, their cash flow is completely out of sync, and you know, they've got another 3 months to go, and that's the end of whoever it is that was getting all the publicity and was in the front window at Browns 6 months ago. So what I'm suggesting is that fashion designers also need to know, not, I would argue, the standard suggestion is, oh, what they need is more business studies. Now, I would say, no, they don't need business studies, because all business studies tells them about is a business plan. And they get business plans coming out of their ears. What I'm suggesting is that they need to know about production. They need to know about who makes the clothes, under what conditions. They need to know about pricing and costing, and about how actually to see something through from idea right through to execution. Now, final point in relation to the designers. Many of them don't want to know about production, and they certainly don't want to know about how poorly paid the Asian woman or the woman working at home is, how exploited she is. There's a refusal on the part of most designers, and indeed all the designers I've interviewed, they've always said, well, I don't really know about that. And what they mean is they don't really want to know about that, because of course they're going to feel guilty if they realize that the suit that they are making for their order for Browns or Harvey Nichols is actually being produced by a long chain of production, wherein at the bottom end, the person who's actually doing the sewing is again working all hours, round the clock, for £1 an hour. And they don't want to know that because the reason they don't want to know it is because they also see themselves as working in a kind of sweated conditions. They are also, if you like, participating in a form of self-exploitation. They're working round the clock and their cash flows are so small. So in a sense, they don't see any way of connecting with the poor woman at the bottom of the chain of production, because they're so concerned themselves with just keeping their head above water and somehow keeping in business. And all that would happen is that they would feel very guilty, or apologetic, or simply not wanting to know. So as it stands, there is really very little connection between the women who are working in the units of production on the Hornsey Road and designers like Pam Hogg or Ali Capolino or any of the people who you might buy your clothes from. So as it stands, there isn't a connection, but I'm suggesting that maybe there can be. Now, where can that connection come from? And how can we begin to think across these various component parts of the fashion industry? Now, earlier I talked a little bit about the training of fashion designers and the art school training that most of them go through, and my sample were all graduates from Central St. Martin's. And so the next question I want to ask is, well, what's wrong with training? In many ways, our training is seen as first class. It has a wonderful reputation abroad. Fashion academics are incredibly highly considered, which is quite right. Many fashion academics are ex-designers themselves. Why is it, or what's lacking in fashion education that somehow means that fashion designers, once they leave college, once the initial buzz of the collection is over, once they've traipsed round Donna Karan in New York and not got any success, once they find themselves on the dole, what is it what has gone wrong? Why is it that education provides such an up, and then employment seems to produce such a down? Now, my suggestion here is that fashion design education in Britain is too concerned to, if you like, prove its credentials as a fine art discipline or as fine art associated. That fashion education in Britain has always occupied the lower status in the art school. It's always had to prove itself. It's never found the kind of status that it wanted. It's always found itself subordinate to painting and sculpture, to fine art, and even to graphic design. And for that reason, fashion educationists are continually reminding the students that what they're doing is creative work. Likewise, fashion academics are tremendously proud of the fashion geniuses that they produce, like John Galliano or Alexander McQueen or whoever. Of course, that's a tiny, tiny minority. That's one in hundreds and thousands. At present, across the whole of the British Isles, almost 3,000 graduates emerge each year with a degree in fashion design. So the fact that one or two make it is really a very small percentage. So my suggestion would be that fashion education is too worried about its low-status connotations. It's too worried about being seen as being feminine and also associated with horror, of all horrors, dressmaking. And fashion academics are terribly concerned that what they're doing is real creative, high-level work, so that they often reproduce the level of the binary divide between high culture and low culture, and they disparage the production end of fashion. So that for this reason, students can indeed go through 3 years of study and really not have very much training at all, if any, in the basic elements of production. And so what I would suggest is that what fashion education needs is actually to take some of the design students to a workshop, to actually talk about manufacture, and to raise the question of production. And actually, as a sociologist, I would say, well, what fashion design students need is to be taught about fashion as a labor process, as a kind of work, as something which needs these high level of skills, not just at the creative end, but right through, all the way through. So I would suggest that education and training has been too concerned to prove its fine art credentials, to represent fashion as conceptual, and to, in so doing, disparage or disavow production skills. Now that leaves us with 3 other areas that all contribute to the fashion industry and that are all equally important to fashion industry. And the next major sector, indeed some people would say the most thriving sector in the fashion industry, is that of retail. And again, journalists will often say, well, the reason that British fashion designers can't survive or can't succeed is because of the power in Britain of the big chain retailers, of course Marks and Spencer's, but also stores like Next, and the chain stores eat into something like 51% of fashion purchases in Britain come from less than 6 stores, John Lewis, Debenhams, Marks and Spencer's, and a few others. So that fashion academics will often say, well, the British fashion industry doesn't have a chance to survive because Marks and Spencer's or even Kukai or Warehouse can translate what the designers are doing and turn it into something much cheaper very rapidly, and they have much more cash at their disposal. They have a huge turnover. They have all the suppliers working for them on whatever basis. So they can cut their costs and they, in effect, replace fashion design. They, in effect, make it almost impossible for designers to survive. Now, again, I want to put a slightly different angle on that. I want to say, well, okay, if retail is so successful, let's think about what a career in fashion retail involves. What role can retail play in revitalizing the fashion industry? Is there any way in which retail can actually connect with designers? Now, in fact, as you probably or may well already know, some of the big retailers actually have recently attempted to increase the input of their design element. They have attempted to inject into their goods, their stock, a higher design element. And Marks and Spencer's have been at the forefront of buying in designs from Ali Capellino, from Paul Smith, from Lisa Bruce, from a whole range of designers, and have produced a higher value, a higher level of design in their stock. Likewise, Debenhams, if you see on the buses, there's a Jasper Conran dress done for Debenhams. So recently there has been some attempt on the part of the retailers to connect with British fashion designers. However, there's a limit here because the number of designers that they actually bring in, again, is really not much more than a handful. And also, they too are often working for a couple of years on a short-term contract. So the number of designers who Marks and Spencer's will actually bring in on a freelance basis are never more than half a dozen. And often they're already very well established. For a while, Helen Story was working for Marks and Spencer's, Jasper Conran, Ali Capellino, all names who you'll be familiar with. What I'm interested in is the people who are struggling to get off the ground and to survive. And clearly, the big retailers are not going to employ all of them. In fact, the big retailers are completely uninterested in what they're doing. So this means that we're still left with this group of, every year, about 3,000 young designers trying to make a living. What else, or what other role could retail play, and how could we revitalize retail to make it connect in different ways with fashion designers, not just in terms of buying them in as freelance designers? Now, one or two retailers have already attempted to try and introduce a better, more energetic design element. And the most well-known of these is, of course, Paul Smith. And Paul Smith has got a reputation for being a very progressive retailer in this respect. And what Paul Smith and other retailers like Jigsaw and Whistles do is, of course, bring in young designers in a capacity as design assistants. Now, again, the problem there is that they're often there for 2 or 3 years, and they're not developing their own label. They're not actually working in an independent capacity. So there's a limit to the way in which retail can mop up British design talent. There seems to be a set of strategies across retail which have attempted, perhaps for publicity reasons, to look as though they're making better use of British fashion designers, but actually that's relatively limited. The next question, however, that also has to be asked of retail is that if British fashion is so connected with retail, if most people in Britain, even fashion-conscious consumers, would prefer to buy their clothes in a chain retail store, then we also have to think of that area as an area of employment. We also have to think about retailers as actually employers. What kind of career is it in retail? Now, once again, my study of British fashion designers has shown that many of the designers, once they can no longer afford a unit at Hyper, once they go bust or they're on the brink of bankruptcy, what they do is actually get jobs as shop assistants. And so that there's actually a trading down, that people who have a degree in design and who want to practice as designers, nonetheless find themselves working behind the counter. And that indicates a kind of level of upskilling in retail and downskilling in design. So that, again, is an interesting development in terms of what actually happens to British fashion designers, that they often end up managing a shop. Now, in relation to fashion retail, what one might also then suggest is that a new form of association, a new form of awareness in relation to the fashion industry can emerge out of retail. Very, very few people working in retail belong to a trade union. The trade union for shop workers, USDAW, has got almost nil membership in terms of British retailers. People who work in Whistles or in Jigsaw or in Hobbs or in Goldsmiths, none of them belong to trade unions. Nor does it ever look as though they're likely to become members of trade unions. There's a very low level of trade unionisation. Now, if we want to get the British fashion industry more successful, better wages, a more secure form of employment, one would therefore need to think perhaps not in terms of traditional trade union activity, because that seems almost like a thing of the past in contemporary Britain, but rather to try to encourage and to promote the people working in retail in terms of actually being participants in the fashion industry. So what I'm saying is that we could indeed upgrade and upskill the ways in which people are earning a living by working in shops like Whistles. We could somehow make them better places to work. We could develop forms of association, forms of pressure group, which actually allowed people who were working in the shop as shop assistants to actually use to a greater extent the more flexible and the larger range of skills that they've got. Now that leaves us with two final areas of the fashion industry which also play an incredibly important role in the industry as a whole. And the crucial element, indeed, many people would say the key to the success of British fashion is the fashion media and the fashion press, fashion magazines and the fashion trade papers, but also the role of fashion journalists. Now, in fact, if you think how many pages every day, even in quality newspapers, as well as in fashion magazines, contain images, photographs from the collections, from the shows, what we can say with some degree of certainty is that the fashion media has expanded enormously in the last 15 years. There is now a huge fashion press. There isn't a newspaper across the country which hasn't got a fashion page. Many of them have got fashion coverage more than one day a week. As you know, fashion designers frequently make it to the front pages of all the quality newspapers. So there is a large fashion mass media. There's also television programs. There's a new program just started last week on Channel 4. There's the clothes show. So the fashion media has expanded. What can it do? What role can it play? What I would want to suggest to you this evening is that the field of women's magazines, the fashion magazines, the Standard, Vogue, Marie Claire, Elle, are remarkably timid when it comes to actually engaging or seriously looking at the fashion industry. They're remarkably uninterested in what goes on behind the scenes. Now, the reason for this, and I've asked them, I've interviewed almost all the editors, and what they say is, well, we don't want to hear the bad news about fashion because we see ourselves as being supporting the British fashion industry. And our loyalty to the British fashion industry means that we only say good things, yeah? We only promote. We only talk about the upbeat, we don't talk about the downside. And what our role is to do is to somehow support British fashion industry and to give our column inches every day or every week to Galliano or whoever, and not to actually do anything more than that. Now, I would suggest that not only is this timid, but it's also very unadventurous editorially. It leads to a very bland kind of coverage. In many ways, fashion magazines are very fearful, very conservative forms. Why is it that in 50 years of Vogue magazine, more recently Marie Claire or Elle, not one of them has ever run a story which might expose bad practice in the fashion industry, that would expose the way in which students, like the students I interviewed, often worked for 6 weeks without a contract for some of the famous French fashion houses. Or it never exposes how their ideas get ripped off. It would never expose how, again, many of the graduates I interviewed, their stock, one of them had a shop in Portobello Market, Portobello Green. She was doing very well. One day, 3 young, smartly dressed men came in and they bought the entire stock. They bought every single thing in the shop, and she couldn't believe her luck. She thought, this is brilliant, you know, I'm cleared out, you know, I've made how many thousands. In fact, what they did was, and again, this might be no surprise to you, they actually cut down the garments, stitch by stitch. They unpicked every single seam, every hem. 3 months later, this graduate student, Harriet, was in New York. She was in the stores where she had already been supplying her designs, and she was in other stores as well. And what does she see but exactly her garments, made up stitch by stitch. It was very exclusive, very complicated knitwear. She saw her stock there at, you know, 1/10 of the price. And when Bloomingdale customers reported, oh yes, but I can get this in Macy's for $10, why are you charging $300? They withdrew their order from her and she went bankrupt. So no fashion magazine ever draws attention to how widespread copying and ripping off is a practice. They never draw any attention to bad practice, unscrupulous practice, or dishonesty in the fashion industry. And I think that's incredibly timid of them. Instead, they're just full of, you know, hyperbole and full of publicity. And they say, well, we don't want to show the downside of British fashion, but also we don't want our advertisers to withdraw their revenue. And if we do an expose on how Calvin Klein is using child labor from Ecuador, you know, our magazine is not going, I'm going to lose my job, basically. You know, jobs are at stake. Our job as editors is to keep the advertising revenue coming in because the magazines rely on advertising revenue. Therefore, you have this very bland, very uncritical, just glossy world of women's magazines. Now, finally, in relation to that, my suggestion would be that it's about time that women's magazines become a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more challenging, and that women's magazines actually need to be a bit more challenging because they exist in a bit of a ghetto. Women's magazines are seen as the lowest end of journalism. They have very low status in the world of the mass media, in fact. Very few journalists who work for women's magazines, very few fashion journalists ever make it into the mainstream of journalism. It actually, as a place to work, fashion journalism is also not very rewarding. Many fashion journalists find themselves dropping out or giving up after a few years. And so what I would suggest is that the magazines could be a little bit less fearful. They could take a few more risks. It may well be that their advertising revenue wouldn't drop. Final point, their readers are actually more intelligent these days. Women's magazines and fashion magazines tend to always think they have to talk down to their readers. They assume their readers are, if you like, less intelligent and less well-educated than they are. But as we know, more and more women are going to university, more women are highly qualified in British society in the 1990s. There's no reason why the fashion magazines couldn't actually run more intelligent, more critical, more analytical stuff on the fashion industry. And that might also put them into a slightly more important role in terms of policy. It might actually give good editors, like Glenda Bailey, who was the editor at Marie Claire, it might actually give the fashion magazines more of a prominent role in terms of policy. Now, the final area that I want to draw attention to is that of consumption. Who buys clothes, and what can consumers do? And what we often find in fashion academic writing, fashion journalism, is people say, oh, well, British consumers don't want to pay money for their clothes. They're unlike Italian consumers, unlike French consumers. British consumers only want to buy cheap clothes. Now, again, let's work out how that can be reconceptualized. In fact, British consumers don't all want low design clothes. If they did, we wouldn't see such a wonderful arrangement of styles, not just in London, but right across the UK. So the idea that British consumers prefer to play safe and buy in C&A and Marks and Spencer's is actually factually and statistically incorrect. Certainly over certain ages and within certain income brackets, people want to buy cheap. But even if they want to buy cheap, that doesn't mean that they want better design. And so there is a possibility that consumers could have high design content but not have to pay £400 for it. And that, again, is a challenge economically. How can the British fashion industry succeed, make profits, make a living for the designers, also create a market? How can it create a viable market of people who can afford the clothes and who can enjoy high design content and who can actually revitalize the industry? Now, if that sounds like an unsurmountable problem, I would say, well, actually, we can already see signs of this happening. For example, in dance and club culture, amongst young people who go clubbing, they spend large amounts of money on clothes. It is they who keep many of the designers going in units like Hyper, in Camden Lock, and lots of the small design stores. It's they who represent a very vigorous market of consumers. It's, if you like, the club cultural consumers who currently are actually keeping most young designers in business. They buy a lot of clothes, but also they don't buy terribly expensive clothes. And if you go to Hyper, you'll find that the clothes are actually relatively cheaper than certainly if you go to the name designers like Ali Capolino or Nicole Farry or even Whistles. And the way in which the level of clothing can be kept low, and this is my final point, is that within these small units, there is a closer relationship between the producers of design and the producers of the clothing themselves. That these small units in Camden Lock, in Hyper, actually comprise of what we might describe as microeconomies. Yes? It is designers there who are keeping their overheads low, who are only employing 2 or 3 machinists, who are actually cutting out the middlemen, who are attempting to keep their costs manageable. Only they can remain in business. And so, to conclude, what I'd like to suggest, just to summarize, is that fashion education should pay more attention to what it means to actually produce clothes. It should give students a better training in production, so that they know what to look for in when their garments are made up, so that they can actually work with the producers directly and tell them what they want, and so that they can also do better costing. Fashion design education has been too concerned with high art, with the only creative conceptual dimension. Secondly, fashion magazines can be a little bit more challenging, a little bit more risk-taking. There is absolutely no reason to believe that all the fashion editors would lose their jobs if they ran an expose story on Donna Karan. It's been happening in New York, and they haven't gone out of business. The editors haven't been sacked. Indeed, they've been seen to be more responsible. And so the fashion magazines could become socially and politically more responsible if they broke out of this tradition of just being gushy and supportive and flattering. Thirdly, I would say that the designers themselves need to be able to think through more clearly what they're doing. They need more support. They want to stay in London, but they also need to be able to understand the processes of production. They perhaps also need to be able to think both creatively and commercially. And finally, I don't actually think there is a great problem around consumption, because Britain does remain a country of very enthusiastic consumers. The problem is that of cost, and the economic dilemma or the economic challenge is how the cost of clothing can be brought within the incomes and the budgets of those who are the most enthusiastic consumers. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Thank you. Well, if I could just reply to that, I don't think I'm 10 years out of date. I did the research for this in the early 1990s, and I actually visited almost every art school in the country, and I conducted quite detailed, lengthy interviews with a range of fashion academics, with professors of fashion, heads of department up and down the country. You may well be correct to indicate that in the last few years there has been a shift in the direction of bringing into fashion design education a more commercial, a more business element, but I'm sorry, my research shows that to be still quite marginal. Well, if I can also just say, in defense of myself, even the students who were indeed, none of them had visited a factory, and I don't know if your students visit factories. Okay, well, in that case, thank you for letting me know that. That's not the case with the students who I've interviewed. But even the students who have had some skills in production and manufacture, when I've interviewed them, what they emphasize, and it could be that they're misleading me, but what they emphasize entirely is their interest in their own creative work. And that in most cases, there has been a disavowal and a lack of interest in the production side. And what they are most concerned with is precisely their absolute emphasis on their own work, on their creative identities. Okay. But I'm not suggesting they're swamped with political views. I thought I was just making the point that it might be interesting on occasion for these magazines. Well, I think the days of trying to be completely independent and are really over where we live in such a sophisticated mass media. On the other hand, media is cheaper, and I don't think it's impossible to imagine a fashion media that was viable economically and that did take some risks. And in fact, in some ways we can see, I mean, magazines like Don't Tell It or even The Face magazine has been politically quite challenging, but it's been challenging at the level of ideas and style, but not really connecting with questions of how people earn a living and whether or not they earn a living. So all I'm suggesting is that those connections have got to be made. And if that's political, I'm happy to be political. I've been doing this work in terms of, you know, this is a major sector of the British economy. It's one that continues, despite what this person says, to be in a state of crisis. And it's just a great pity that this happens. And I don't think it's got to happen. It could be revitalized. Oh, sure. Oh, I mean, I think the fashion schools have got tremendous links with industry. I'm well aware of that. No, I'm sorry, I didn't say there was no links with the retail trade from the art schools. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that there were no link-ups there. Well, the connection to feminism was really to suggest that the great leading lights in British fashion continue to be male figures for whatever reason, but as a field of employment, it's a very heavily feminized sector at almost every level, from shop assistants to machinists to designers themselves. It's a feminized sector. It's a female field of employment. And feminists started off being critical of fashion because of its exploitative connotations. Then they simply saw it as a field of enjoyment and gave it the seal of approval. And what I'm suggesting is that we need a kind of third level of feminist input, which brings those various component parts together and which tries to think about it in terms of policy. How can it actually be a better place for all these women to work, is what I'm saying. If we want to keep people in work, if we want more women to be able to earn a living in a decent way, how can we make it a better place to work? Well, absolutely, and the reason that I've been doing this work is to actually kind of use fashion as an example of ways of earning a living in Britain in the creative cultural sectors, which are, after all, almost the only thriving sectors of the British economy right now, and also which are part of our post-industrial economy. And very little research has been done on how people make a living in these sectors. So the fashion industry is one example. We could also look at television independent production companies. What kind of... Well, yes, I mean, feminism, I'm looking at it as a feminized sector, but it also has much wider ramifications in terms of work in Britain today, and also young people looking for work in the cultural industries. Exactly. I mean, even if we think of them as being small businesses, it's also the case that very little attention has been paid recently by New Labour to thinking through how small businesses can be revitalised. And the emphasis on stakeholding is all geared towards huge, big companies. And in fact, various indicators show that in 10 years' time, there'll be even fewer very large companies and very large employers in Britain, and that the mainstream of employers will actually have something like less than 10 employees. So again, for this reason, I think fashion is actually quite symbolic, really. I think there was a question down here. Yeah. Well, I think that's... I mean, that also raises a question of exports and to what extent can British designers actually sell abroad. And my analysis, my research actually shows that most British fashion designers, their level of export is very, very small indeed. And that there's only, again, a handful of British fashion designers who have got substantial sales abroad, although that has been changing in the last 2 or 3 years. But it's only been changing because that handful are actually selling more successfully abroad. It's not been changing because young designers are breaking into the international market. I think that's what the point you made is very interesting and difficult to, one would need to kind of talk about it in a bar in greater length, I think.